Welcome to the Profile Corner. In a previous video, we started working on this plane holder that'll be going up onto the French cleat wall. We need to start mounting the planes onto the plane holder, and so we need to first establish a board that'll go along the bottom here that'll allow the planes to rest on that board. And so this board was chosen to go down here at the bottom. However, I don't need the board to be quite that tall. I only need it to be about 1.5 inches if my calculations are correct. What I want to do is have a round over on this edge as well as the other side here, and then the board will be sitting upright 1.5 inches tall, the length of this. So I should get started here with a 1/4 inch roundover bit that I've got mounted into this palm router. Okay, now we can head over to the table saw and cut this off so that it's 1.5 inches wide. I have the rip fence set to 1.5 inches. There's not a lot of clearance between the blade guard and the rip fence, but I can squeeze my narrow push stick into that location, so I should be able to feed the board through. I've got a little bit of an issue here that because of the length of this board, it's going to be touching the arm of the crosscut table. I could swing that arm out of the way, but I think I can feed it through just like this. And since I've got the blade raised up a little bit, I should be able to still get it to cut through, even though the back end of the board is going to be raised up. There was a significant amount of tension in that board, and so I wouldn't be surprised if this board is warped. Okay, and it is significantly warped. I don't know if the camera is going to be able to pick that up, but there is a significant curvature to it, and so that may pose a little bit of a challenge to us getting this secured down onto the assembly for the planes. But we should be able to make something happen here, I think, if we use some screws to help hold it in place, along with glue. Okay, now I need to square up the one end and then cut it to 60 inches long. It appears as though if we use enough clamps, we'll be able to tease all of the warpage out of this board. So we've got a little bit of a warpage here. I'm not sure if it'll be able to be picked up on the camera, but it does curve quite a bit. So let's get started with the glue up. I'll give this an hour and a half to set up. Then I'll come out and scrape off the excess glue. And then we can flip this over and sink some screws in from the back side to add a little bit of additional strength to this joint. And while we're waiting for this glue to dry, we can start working on the 1/4 inch dividers that'll divide the planes in this area here. I have some boards that are cut down to about 3 inches wide or slightly narrower than that. Now I'm going to resaw these. I have the blade raised up about 1.5 inches or a little bit over 1.5 inches, maybe 1 5/8 inches, which means that I'll run the boards through and then flip the board over and run it through a second time. That should be a little bit of a safer operation than trying to cut all the way through in one go. That way I can use push sticks to hold it. I've also got these mag switch feather boards set up. Unfortunately, this larger one is slipping a little bit. And so I've got the smaller mag switch feather board set up to hopefully prevent this from sliding outward. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll resaw these boards. Just over a 1/4 inch thick, maybe by a 64th of an inch. That way I can sand down the boards afterwards. I'll run them through the second time after I get all the boards run through the first time. And I can relocate the feather boards so that we're giving proper support to these narrower boards. definitely makes a mess doing that resawing. I'll run these through the wide drum sander and then we'll rejoin with the camera. I've rounded both edges here of this board using the 1/4 inch round over, as well as these two edges here. And now what I'll do is I'll cut 1.25 inches off each side of this board, and then we'll be able to put these onto the assembly at the sides to help add a little bit of support so that the planes are less likely to shift off to the side of the assembly once they're on the assembly. I had to remove the blade guard because I don't have quite enough clearance on the back side here to be able to squeeze the push stick through. It gets caught right up in this area here. And you may have noticed when I go to grab the push stick, I'm continuing to push the board forward with my other hand, even if it's just a little bit. That's to help cut down on the risk of burning of the wood. As you can see back here, we got quite a bit of burning, but not nearly as much as we could have. And we didn't get hardly any burning back here when I shifted over to grabbing the push stick, and that's because I kept moving the board forward. And you want to make sure that you're moving the board forward at a consistent pace to help eliminate the risk of bad cuts. Next, I need to cut the boards to 25.25 inches long. I need to get rid of a little bit of a bad section here that did not get cleaned up during planing. So I'll get that cut off first. I need to put in some screws here on the bottom side. The 1.5 inch tall, 3/4 inch wide board is on the other side that we glued in a little while ago, and now I need to pre-drill some holes for screws. Okay, now we can flip this over and then attach the boards we just cut at the table saw. Unfortunately, this board here is warped ever so slightly, causing a 1/32 inch gap down here at the bottom. So what I'll try to do is to use a parallel jaw clamp to pull this board this direction. It's also extending out beyond the end of the plywood down here by about a 1/32 of an inch. So I'm hoping that with a parallel jaw clamp, I can pull this board this way a little bit in the process of straightening this board. Okay, let's get this board glued on. I'll rub the board back and forth a little bit just to make sure that the glue gets spread out. I'll get the other one glued up exactly the same way on the other end. Okay, we'll let the glue set up for about an hour and a half, and then we can remove the clamps and start scraping down the glue that's squeezed out. In the meantime, we can get working on these boards that we resawed down to 1/4 inch thick. We can actually cut them to 1/4 inch wide at the table saw, and we'll use a thin rip jig to do that. I have a thin rip jig mounted to the table, and what I did is I took a 1/8 inch setup block to represent the blade thickness. I've got the rip fence right up against the blade, and then I used a 1/4 inch setup block next to that, and then I adjusted this inward so that it is almost touching the 1/4 inch setup block. There's possibly a little bit less than a 1/64 of an inch gap in between. And now what I can do is I can back this off, and then we can set the rip fence as necessary so that when we slide the boards in, they touch this bearing on the end. Okay, I've got two boards here that are exactly the same width. I wouldn't want to run this edge through. I want to flip it over so that that's on the back side against the rip fence, so that we don't cut through that, at least not initially. I had to remove the blade guard again because there's not going to be a lot of gap through here for the blade guard to exist while I've got the push sticks going through there. I've got two different push sticks here. This push stick will allow me to get a lot of downward pressure onto the board. And then this one is my usual push stick that I use. Okay, the rip fence has been set so that the distance between here and here is the same as the distance between the bearing and where the rip fence is at. Move the rip fence over so it touches the board. get a few of these attached onto the plywood. Okay, I need to cut 2 of these boards to 24 inches long for the number 8 planes, and one of them to 22 inches long for the number 7 plane. Okay, now we can take my 18 gauge air nailer over and we can attach these. I've got some 1/2 inch long headless pins that we can use to put them in place along with some glue. And I've set one of the number 8 planes up here to find the location of where this board needs to go. This board is ever so slightly wider than 1/4 inch this way, and it's exactly 1/4 inch this way. So now I've got a position here, and then also down here, and here, and here, of where the edge needs to go. This board's warped ever so slightly. I want to glue it in place and also nail it using my 18 gauge brad nailer. I've got some 1/2 inch headless pins in there. These are 18 gauge. Okay, so I'll apply a little bit of glue. And of course, I've got my safety glasses on. I want to shoot it with a brad nailer positioned like this because chances are the brad nail is going to try to twist ever so slightly as it goes in. And I want it to either go in this direction or in this direction, not this way or this way. Okay, that went in nicely. I've got to check and see if we're still in the right position. Okay, let's see if it fits. It does fit with a little bit of a gap there, which is what we wanted to have. Okay, so now we need to position another one of these at 3.5 inches away. Apply a little bit of glue again to this one. I'll slide it back and forth just a little bit, just to make sure that it's well coated. We've got two number 6 planes next. They're the same width as the number 7. These need to be 18 inches long for the boards that we're going to be cutting down. So I need 2 of those cut down to 18 inches. I'll go do that over at the table saw. So the number 5 planes are up next. I've got 5 of those, and they're a ½ inch narrower than the number 6. I need to cut the boards that are 1/4 by 1/4 down to 14 inches. So I'll need 5 of those cut to 14 inches. I'll do that over at the table saw. I've got the number 8s, the number 7, the 2 6s, the 5 5s mounted onto the board now. Now I need to work on the 4s and the 1 3. We can work on creating the clips that'll go at the top of the planes up here to keep them from tipping off the wall. So I'll have the camera rejoined when we're getting ready to cut those clips at the table saw. I'm just exploring a potential layout of other planes. I've got 2 problems with this layout though. One of the problems is that I don't have anywhere for the block planes to go on here. And also I've got 2 wood-bodied planes that are also metal-bodied that don't fit onto here. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that with this going up onto the wall, high up onto the wall, with the 2-step step stool that I created, I'm not able to reach much higher than where this second French cleat is at when this gets mounted up onto the wall. So I wouldn't be able to reach much higher than this point right here. So everything up here would be out of bounds unless I got out the step ladder, which would be harder to get into that area of the shop because of the other things that are in the way. So I'm not going to be able to use essentially this area of the board going over. I've got to get the wood-body planes on here as well. So what I think that I'll do is I'll probably put the wood-body planes in this section right here, and then I'll have to build a second shelf for the other items that are on here, as well as the block planes. Okay, so now the next step here is to create a board that'll go right across here, and it'll have a notch cut into it. The larger 6 through 8 planes require a 1/4 inch notch, or actually a little bit taller notch than that. These smaller planes, like the 5s and the 4s and the 3s, require slightly less than a 1/4 inch. But in order to pick these up, you've got to be able to tilt them like that to get them off the shelf. And so I actually do need to have a 1/4 inch notch for the smaller planes, and probably a 5/16 or a larger notch for the larger 6 through 8 planes. So let's get started making those notched boards now. And I'm at the dado saw here. I have a 3/8 inch wide dado stack mounted in there, and I've got a sacrificial fence board mounted onto the rip fence. This is a new board. So what I need to do first is to raise the dado blade up to cut roughly a 1/2 inch tall. Okay, that actually cut a little bit more than a 1/2 inch, but that's okay. That's not going to cause us any issues. Okay, so now what we can do is we can get this positioned so that only a 1/4 inch of the blade is sticking out. And what I need to do also is to lower it down. And I want to have the blade raised up a 1/2 inch, so I'll use some setup blocks. First to set the height, and then we'll set the width. So here's a 1/2 inch setup block to set the height. Okay, that's there. I'll lock down the blade so that it can't go up any higher. And now I'll set it to the width of a 1/4 inch. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so now I should be ready to run the boards through on edge. And because the dado stack is going to be buried into the fence, I don't have to be quite so careful out here where my fingers are at. I just got to be careful here at the end of the cut that I don't have my fingers near where the blade is going to be coming out. So I'll be using a push stick to keep my fingers out of the way. Okay, so here's the notch that we'll be using for the smaller planes. And for the larger planes, we'll have to make the notch wider. I have one more board left over here that we could use. Of course, I've also got another board here that could be used if absolutely necessary, but this has got the pith of the tree in it, so I wouldn't want to use that unless absolutely necessary. So now we can cut these down to the lengths that are necessary for the planes. And then we can secure these in place with glue and screws. I'm making good progress here getting these planes secured into place. The boards that we cut just a little while ago are now being secured in place using 2 screws. And I'm using a ruler here to set the location of where those screws need to go. Here you can see that I've got the ruler set at a 1/2 inch, and there's a little notch in the end of the ruler, and that allows me to set the location from the end of the boards. So that makes it easy to locate where the screws need to go. So these planes are held in place pretty well. You can't pick up on the front end of the plane, but if you lift at the back of the plane, you can tilt it out, and it comes out nice and easy. You can see there. So what I've done is I've pushed these blocks back as far as they'll go until they touch the toe of the plane side on each side, and that makes it so that it's easy to remove the planes. As you can see there, you can remove them all quite easily, and you can't lift them up. Oddly, this number 8 plane is shorter than the other number 8 plane that's right next to it. I'm not quite sure if that was intentional or not, or if that was a manufacturing design change that Stanley made years ago. Both of those planes are over 100 years old. So now I'm down to just these smaller planes remaining. Some of the smaller planes are longer than others, I've got a Stanley number 3 here, and also a Fulton plane that's exactly the same size. So I'm guessing that that was also supposed to be quite similar to a Stanley number 3. This one here, which is kind of a cheap knockoff plane, this is actually longer than the other number 4s down here. So it looks a little out of place, but that's okay. So I'm just getting ready to screw these in place. So let's go ahead and we'll drill a pilot hole for the screws. Okay, so now that plane is held in place and I can take it out just that easily. I'll do the same for the other 5 planes that are remaining here. Well, I should also mention that I use a 1/4 inch roundover bit and a trim router to round over these edges right here on all the little boards. I did that before I cut them to length, and that makes it a lot easier to hold the planes in place and also provides a nice profiled edge on the blocks. So I'll get the rest of these mounted in place, and then I'll bring the camera back. Yeah, I secured the wooden planes in place the same way I did the metal-bodied planes. I just used the same board at the end, and this is just butted right up against the end of the plane. And I've got the 1/4 inch walnut boards on each side of the plane. I just need to drive in the screws here. Okay, so now that's locked in place, as you can see right there. All that's left to do now is apply a little bit of finish onto this and get it up onto the wall. The planes are up on the French cleat wall now, and I think that the holder turned out rather nice for the planes. I've got some area up there at the top that's not being used, but I think that this will work out okay. Even when I'm stepping on a step stool, I can't quite reach much higher than the top of those planes right through there, and so that area would not really be used anyway. So I'll have to find another location, maybe down in this area here, for the remaining planes to be located. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.